Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Wednesday, the 6th of July. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 133 of the illegal Russian war of aggression. Then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will look at today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. First of all, though, as it's the 6th of July, we remember the 167 men who were lost and their families when the oil and gas production platform Piper Alpha exploded and sank in the North Sea, about 120 miles northeast of Aberdeen. 61 workers escaped and survived, while 30 bodies were never recovered, and they are all in our thoughts today. In Ukraine, the governor of Luhansk has said this morning that fighting continues in the villages around Lysychansk. On Telegram, Sergei Haidai said some settlements have already been under one or another control twice. He repeated that up to 15,000 civilians remain in Lysychansk and 8,000 in Severodonetsk, adding, "Today's videos from Lysychansk are painful to watch." He added, "The Russians are advancing, first of all due to the fact that they are superior in artillery, with which they destroy cities and defence positions. And Europe must prepare for a complete cut-off of Russian gas," says Ursula von der Leyen. The President of the European Commission said the EU needs to make emergency plans to prepare for a complete cut-off of Russian gas. The EU chief accused Russia's President, Vladimir Putin, of using energy as a weapon in an address to lawmakers in Strasbourg today. The Commission is working on a European emergency plan, with its first proposals to be presented by the middle of the month, she said. Von der Leyen also said, if worst comes to the worst, then we have to be prepared. She stressed the importance of having a European overview and coordinated approach to a potential complete cut-off of Russian gas. Now, we are joined this evening by Maureen Watt, who's a retired politician and former Minister for Mental Health in the Scottish Government. Maureen was a member of the Scottish Parliament representing Aberdeen South and North Kincardine from 2011 to 2021, when she retired, having previously been a regional MSP for the North East of Scotland between 2006 and 2011. Maureen has been a teacher and a councillor amongst many roles, and she's part of a very political clan. Her father was a former SNP MP, Hamish Watt, and one of her children, Stuart, served as the SNP MP for Aberdeenshire West and Kincardine at Westminster between 2015 and 2017. Maureen, thank you for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland this evening. How are you keeping?
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm good, thank you. I spent too much time in front of the telly today rather than up and about in the garden, but you couldn't make it up what's been happening today, so it was well worth watching. It's something that doesn't happen very often. I think the last time was 1932 or something, so whether we're blessed or not, I don't know, I don't think so, but to watch it is truly something.
That's absolutely right, Maureen. So far as I can see, the number of resignations currently stands at 38. And as you say, that's more resignations in one day than any previous Prime Minister, we think. And as you say, everybody's glued to their screens waiting to see what's going to happen next. Because Boris Johnson's Prime Ministership was looking fatally undermined as he was hit by a string of new ministerial resignations, while a series of previously loyal backbench MPs withdrew their support over the Chris Pincher affair. A day after Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, and the Health Secretary Sajid Javid quit the government, followed by several junior ministers, two more ministers and one government aide announced their departure, taking the total at that time to more than a dozen. Arguably, even more damaging to Johnson, several previously loyal backbench MPs said they could no longer back the Prime Minister, citing Number 10's changing story about why Pincher was appointed Deputy Chief Whip, despite allegations of groping. Will Quince resigned as Children's Minister, having been sent out to defend the government's position about Pincher on Monday morning, a stance that was reversed within hours. Quince said he had no choice after he appeared on television to defend Johnson using Downing Street briefings, which he says have now been found to be inaccurate. Soon afterwards, the Schools Minister, Robin Walker, a stalwart of a series of ministerial jobs under Johnson, and before him, Theresa May, said he was stepping down. Unfortunately, he said, recent events have made it clear to me that our great party, for which I have campaigned all my adult life, has become distracted from its core missions by a relentless focus on questions over leadership, he wrote in a letter to the Prime Minister. Johnson's achievements, Walker added, had become overshadowed by mistakes and questions about integrity. Victoria Atkins resigned as a Justice Minister, saying in her letter to Johnson, I can no longer pirouette around our fractured values. John Glenn, a long-standing Treasury Minister, stepped down citing Johnson's poor judgment over Pincher, and Felicity Buchan, a junior aide in the Business Department, also stepped down, telling Johnson he had lost the confidence of my constituents and me. Laura Trott, a parliamentary aide in the Transport Department, also resigned, as well as Alex Chalk, the Solicitor General. In a further blow to Johnson, the influential backbencher Robert Halfon announced today he could no longer support the Prime Minister, saying he felt the public have been misled over the resignation of Pincher after further allegations of groping, the catalyst for the escalation of this latest crisis. The parties at Downing Street were bad enough, but the appointments of this individual, meaning Pincher, and the untruthful statements about what was known is unacceptable to me, Halfon wrote. Within minutes of Halfon's statement, Lee Anderson, the previously loyalist MP for Ashfield, said the Pincher case meant he too was withdrawing support. I cannot look myself in the mirror and accept this, Anderson said in a Facebook post. It is my belief that our Prime Minister has got all the big decisions right and guided us through the most difficult time in my lifetime, and I have always backed him to the hilt. That said, integrity should always come first, and sadly this has not been the case over the past few days. The former Minister, Chris Skidmore, then sent a damning letter in which he said Johnson had not been truthful in claiming no knowledge about previous allegations about Pincher's conduct, when the Deputy Chief Whip resigned last week after being accused of drunkenly groping two men. This is an extremely grave situation that is tantamount to an effective cover-up of sexual abuse that would never be tolerated in any normal, functioning workplace. Nadeem Zahawi, who has moved from education to become Chancellor, meanwhile told broadcasters he would get on with his main task of bearing down on inflation. He also said that the Prime Minister was right to apologise over the appointment of Pincher, despite having been told there were allegations about his prior inappropriate behaviour. Asked when the Prime Minister remembered he had been briefed about specific allegations regarding Pincher, Zahawi said, all I would say to you is when the Prime Minister realised he'd made a mistake, he came out and explained that. He said with the benefit of hindsight that I made a mistake. I think that's good leadership to come out and say that, look, I don't get every decision right. The entire saga is a perfect example of why we need rigorous independent journalism. Without scrutiny from The Guardian and other organisations, we wouldn't know about many of this government's failings. There would have been no police fines, no independent investigation into Partygate. We would be none the wiser. So, Maureen, it's been a bit of a challenge writing this part of the script today as the resignations kept flowing. Do you think, and I'll just check to see if it's changed again, it hasn't yet. Do you think that we are now approaching the end game? Is it the beginning of the end? Or in light of what everyone always knew about Johnson, has it always been the beginning of the end from the very moment he became Prime Minister?
Well, I think it has to be the beginning of the end, although, as you say, we've been at the beginning of the end for ages now. Listening to what's been happening today is just quite unbelievable, that he's still holding on, but he seems absolutely determined to stay on. When he was in front of the committee chairs this afternoon, he was quite determined at the end to say that he was carrying on, and I think he'd previously said not just to the next election but the one after. I mean, he seems to be living in a parallel universe. Whether when he went back to Downing Street today, he was given such a talking to by those who are against him that he will change his mind, it's difficult to know. But I think it's previously been said that the only thing would get him out of Downing Street is if there was a fire in the place. So I really don't know when he's going to go, but go he must for the sake of the whole country.
Your point's absolutely right, Maureen. The Matthew Paris, writing in the Times, and now refers to Johnson as the great white sperm whale, argues that given his nature, Johnson will not readily stand down and will have to be removed. Just before we came on air, Bloomberg were reporting that a group of key allies, including Grant Shapps, the Transport Secretary, and the Business Secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, are visiting the Prime Minister and are calling on him to resign. So who do you think, who will have to hand Johnson the figurative glass of malt whisky and a revolver?
Well, I think it might surprisingly be Michael Gove, because apparently he was leading the troops of those against Johnson into Downing Street late afternoon, before Grant Shapps and Nadine Dorris and others of his supporters went in. So where they're all housed in Downing Street, if they're in separate rooms or whatever, I don't know. But, this is very, very serious. 30 plus ministers resigning, including cabinet secretaries and trade envoys and what have you, is a very serious situation for government, because as others have pointed out on other mainstream media, it is the junior ministers who get on with the job of delivering the government's strategy. And if so many have resigned, the pool of people who will be able to take on those roles is decreasing rapidly, because if already 40% are against him, then they're not going to say yes if they're offered a position. So it is a very serious situation for any government to be in.
Thanks, Maureen. We'll look at this story, this evolving story, in a couple of ways this evening, because there are reports that Boris Johnson could face another confidence vote within days, as members of the Conservative Backbench Committee will consider changing its rules as soon as later tonight. Two executive members said it was possible that the 1922 committee could decide to change the rules to allow for another vote. Johnson is protected under the current rules by 1 year's immunity after he won the vote a month ago. Johnson's press secretary insisted he would fight another confidence vote if it were called. Asked if the Prime Minister believed he would win it, she said yes. She said appointments to replace the frontbenchers who resigned since Tuesday night would come over the coming days, and she claimed that Johnson had the support of a majority of his MPs. If the executive changes the rules and enough MPs have sent letters to Sir Graham Brady to demand a new confidence vote, then one could take place immediately. The first ballot was triggered and held the same day. We can move fast if we need to, one MP said. However, the committee is divided about how to proceed, and one said that at least 6 members of the committee could not make the regularly scheduled meeting at 4 p.m. because of other commitments, including questioning Johnson at a meeting of the liaison committee of select committee chairs. One executive member said there was a need for cool heads and for any decision to have total probity. We have to calmly navigate our way through the position and strike a balance on what needs to happen, the MP said. We have to ask ourselves if we have to make a decision of this magnitude at this moment. Is it wise? What does it mean for future leaders? There are other options open to the committee, including waiting until new members are elected, which is expected to be next week. Others favour a delegation going to see the Prime Minister to give him the opportunity to resign. One executive member said they could make it clear to MPs that if 50% of the parliamentary party, enough for the Prime Minister to lose a confidence vote, wrote to Brady to demand a change of leader, the Prime Minister would know that he had to go. So, Maureen, in terms of taking a little bit of a look at this crisis as it's still unfolding, do you think that it is Pincher's conduct that's caused this, or is it the untruths told by and on behalf of Johnson and then formally complained about by Simon MacDonald, which are at the root of this crisis?
Well, it's a combination of all the things that have happened in recent months. But I think what struck me was Sajid Javid's resignation speech today after PMQs. It was, to him, I think, and to many others, it was the fact that cabinet ministers and junior ministers were being sent out to the media to tell lies, actually, because they were given the wrong information by Boris Johnson's team in number 10 Downing Street. And I think that got to so many people. that was the straw that broke the camel's back, and we have the situation that we're in today. But as we've already spoken about, how that's going to change, we don't know. I think, personally speaking, I don't think that he's going to go this week. I think that because he'll hold on to the bitter end literally by his nail fingertips if necessary. But I think if there's new elections to the Backbench 1922 committee at the beginning of next week, it sounds to me as if they will change the rules so that there will be another vote of no confidence. It's just such a pity that the first one was too premature, really. If they'd waited to after the two by-elections, I think it would have been more than 40%. I think if it happens again, it certainly will mean that Boris Johnson's will lose that vote of confidence among his own backbenchers. But is he going to go? I mean, really, it sounds as if he's going to have to be dragged kicking and screaming out of 10 Downing Street because he loves it so much.
I think you're right now, and I agree with your analysis there. However, I'm just watching, and I can see that Robert Peston says it may happen in the next few hours. And Pippa Crerar, who writes for the Mirror and was the journalist who's been fundamental to Partygate, says that there are reports of lots of tears on Downing Street now. Assumption is he will go today. So we will see, is probably the best way of putting it. However, the one broader question here is, what does it say about the constitution that we have in the United Kingdom at the moment, that the country's leader is hired and fired by a secret committee of Tory MPs?
Absolutely. I mean, nothing straightforward like a vote of confidence in the floor of the House of Commons. That doesn't seem to be coming forward. Which would be, I think, the normal way in which one would get rid of the Prime Minister, or indeed, I think in Scotland, it would, that would happen if it ever came to a First Minister having to go. So it does show the antiquated rules that dominate in that place down there, and the quicker we're away from it, the better.
Thanks, Maureen. Now, as I said there, Boris Johnson's press secretary claimed that Johnson had the support of a majority of his MPs. Now, do you think that's true, or is it just more deceit and deflection from the operation inside Number 10?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, I think he's living in a parallel universe. I mean, it's clear that he doesn't have the support of the majority of his MPs anymore. Have you seen anybody coming out to defend him today on the media? If you looked at them during PMQs, the heads were down and they were very silent. They were not cheering him as they normally would when he's answering questions of the opposition leaders and opposition MPs. So it was a very different House of Commons today. I think most of them now realise that the game is up for him. There were very few people in Vox Pops throughout the country supporting him, and mainly because of the lies that everyone now knows that he clearly tells. I think anyone who's followed him knows that he's been telling lies most of his life. But I think now people are just saying, please go, because this is embarrassing on the international stage. If nowhere else, please just go.
Absolutely, Maureen. And thinking about those, I think we've heard, as you say, very few people have been doing their rounds on the media, but there have been a couple of quotes from the likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg and inevitably Alistair Jack, who I think is now the only Tory MP in Scotland who still supports the Prime Minister. But thinking about those who have not resigned and have not spoken out in respect of the events and the Prime Minister, what do you think the prospects for most of the remaining senior cabinet, most of whom who have not resigned, are they now going to be forever tainted by their close association with and loyalty to Johnson?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer, I think. Getting into the minds of those Johnson loyalists who've stayed and then might hope to run to replace him, are they going to be tainted, as you say, by him and by his antics? or do they think that loyalty to him might see them through in a contest? It's very difficult for, I think, to know that. I mean, apart from the obvious people like, as you say, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Nadine Dorris, who are totally in love with the guy. But yes, how it, some people I think said earlier today that Sajid Javid's speech was a pitch for leadership. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But how it goes from here, I think it's very difficult to predict.
Completely, and the situation is obviously developing very, very quickly. We'll look at the story now from a slightly more Scottish perspective, because the leader of the Conservatives in Scotland, Douglas Ross, says that his position on Boris Johnson hasn't changed, according to his spokesperson. Ross previously voted against Johnson in a vote of confidence after submitting a letter to the powerful 1922 committee calling for the vote to be held. However, after Johnson survived the challenge, which under the Conservative Party rules grants him 12 months of immunity from another vote, Ross said he was not in favour of changing the rules, describing himself as a stickler to the rules. The Scottish Tory leader was joined by fellow Scottish MPs John Lamont, Andrew Bowie and David Mundell in voting against the Prime Minister, while the Scottish Secretary of State Alistair Jack and David Duguid, who has now resigned, stood by the PM at the time. Jack is so far the only Scottish Tory MP to publicly back Johnson in light of the scandal that is unfolding. Alistair Jack said, "I fully support the Prime Minister. I am sorry to see good colleagues resign, but we have a big job of work to do, and that's what we're getting on with." BBC's Good Morning Scotland has reported that neither Douglas Ross, Alistair Jack, or any Scottish Conservative MPs were willing to speak to them. This morning, Stephen Kerr, the chief whip for the Tories at Holyrood, said, "Yesterday was a busy and chaotic day. However, in the 300-plus year history of the United Kingdom, it is just one more chapter." He continued, "The UK is bigger than any person, government, party or policy, and people seeking to break it up off the back of any of those aren't being honest with you." The PM won a vote of confidence, he said, in his leadership last month, and is safe from another vote for a year unless the rules are changed. Now, in response, Joe Fitzpatrick said, "Douglas Ross and his Scottish Tory colleagues normally need no encouragement to jump on the airwaves to defend Boris Johnson and his disastrous UK government. It's telling that when the House of Cards appears to be ready to fall, the media isn't able to speak to any of them." In the past 24 hours, senior Tories have made it abundantly clear they have no confidence in Johnson. It's time for Scottish Tories to come out of hiding and face up to that reality too. He continued, "While the Prime Minister clings on to save his political skin at the expense of Scotland and the whole UK, Douglas Ross could choose to support plans to oust the Prime Minister via the 1922 committee. In the national interest, Scottish Tory MPs must now commit to backing these proposals." He finally said, "With the full powers of independence, Scotland can rid ourselves of a chaotic Westminster control once and for all. In the meantime, it's time for Douglas Ross to tell the public whether he still supports a UK government led by Boris Johnson." So, Stephen Kerr said yesterday was a busy and chaotic day. However, in the 300-plus year history of the UK, it's just one more chapter. Would it have been more accurate for Stephen Kerr to say it's just one more chaotic chapter?
Absolutely, and he's a master of trite comments, as Stephen Kerr. I think he's a bit like Boris Johnson. He doesn't take anything particularly seriously in it, unless it's his dreadful jibes off camera during FNQs, and any time that he can be derogatory of our own First Minister. But to get back to Douglas Ross, I mean, he's done U-turn upon U-turn upon U-turn, and I don't think he really knows where he's at the moment. I mean, if he has no confidence in Boris Johnson, you would think that he'd be wanting to get rid of him at any cost for the benefit of not just Scotland, but the whole of United Kingdom. Yet he seems to be saying that he's not in favour of a rule change, which de facto means that he's in favour of keeping Boris Johnson, unless he knows another way of getting rid of him that's going to work, because there doesn't seem to be anything available to make him go. He doesn't seem to have any integrity to go when he can clearly see that the majority of his party don't back him, not just in the House of Commons, but also in the country, with the dreadful by-election results that they had a couple of weeks ago, and any polling that's done throughout the whole of the UK. So it's, as I said earlier, it's difficult to know what's going to happen, but it doesn't shine a light particularly brightly on the credibility of the Scottish Tories. They all now are against him. I think when the vote of confidence was taken, 4 out of the 6 voted for the no confidence in Boris Johnson. Only Jack and Dougad voted for Boris Johnson, and now just about an hour ago, David Duguid has now jumped ship and says he's no longer supporting Johnson. So that just leaves Jack, and I hope nobody thinks that Jack is representing Scotland down there at the moment. He seems to be representing himself and representing Boris Johnson in Scotland, which is a totally untenable position for him and the Tory party.
Completely, Maureen, thank you. Sky News are reporting Tory MP Pauline Latham saying it's a farce. He's a wounded animal desperately trying not to get killed. And so that kind of language, which I'm guilty of too, is continuing. But seeing as he brought it up, I thought it was useful just to talk to you about it. Stephen Kerr talks about the 300 plus year history of the United Kingdom. What are the chances, do you think, that Johnson and his government, by their behaviour and the way in which they've been conducting themselves, are writing the final chapter for the Union?
Well, it's certainly adding more nails into the coffin of the Union. There's absolutely no doubt about that. I mean, I've not met anybody who isn't totally embarrassed by what's happening down at Westminster, and more and more people are saying to me that the sooner we get rid of them, the better. And Johnson is the catalyst at the moment. But what if we get somebody who's from the Johnson camp who's even worse than Johnson, if that's at all possible? But it is possible if we get someone like Liz Truss or Priti Patel or Dominic Raab or Jacob Rees-Mogg, God forbid. So it's the whole of the current Tory party that has been tainted by Boris Johnson's antics, and it's going to be very difficult for any of them to go to the electorate having been part of that governing party, not just part of the government in Westminster, I think.
Absolutely right, Maureen. Thank you. And the BBC, and this is the way it works nowadays. The BBC are reporting that the Times is reporting that Priti Patel has now changed her position this afternoon, and having supported the Prime Minister yesterday, has now joined the group of cabinet ministers who went to see him this evening and asked him to resign. One other thing, Maureen, with regard to the way in which this has been reporting, thinking of the media coverage for a moment, from what I could see, Tories, including ministers in London, were doorstepped pretty effectively yesterday by the BBC and others. Why do you think the BBC either fails or refuses to do the same to Conservative politicians in Scotland?
Oh, well, that's a question. I wonder who can answer that for you. I can't, but the way that the BBC continually and continues to support Westminster governments in the face of overwhelming support for the SNP at all levels of government, and from 2007 really, right through now, latest being the council elections, that at every level of government, the SNP comes out top. I've heard it say that it's the most successful party in Western Europe. And, you know, these are people who are making the conscious decision to vote for the SNP, knowing quite clearly what the SNP's stance is on independence and what our policies are. And continuing to be elected shows that the electorate of Scotland have confidence in the SNP, and it's really time that the BBC starts to that. Although some fact that the BBC doesn't reflect that helps the cause of independence.
That's a very good point, Maureen. Thank you. Now, we'll put the chaotic scenes in Westminster to one side for a moment, but we'll continue to think about the impact of Johnson and his government on the Union, because the EU says there is no justification for the UK to change the Brexit agreement on Northern Ireland. There is no legal or political justification whatsoever for Britain to change the Northern Ireland Protocol that was part of its divorce agreement with the European Union, the bloc's post-Brexit negotiator said today. We need to be realistic. No alternative solution has been found, and it is not needed, the European Commissioner Maros Šefčovič told the European Parliament in Strasbourg. There is no legal or political justification whatsoever for the UK to unilaterally change an international agreement, he added, referring to the proposed legislation allowing Britain to scrap some of the rules on post-Brexit trade with Northern Ireland. So, Maureen, putting the chaotic scenes in Westminster to one side for a moment, if we can, what do you think is possible or likely to happen next regarding the status of the Northern Ireland Protocol?
Well, it's absolutely disgraceful that Boris Johnson thinks he can just brush aside agreements that were hard fought on both the EU and the UK government in coming out of the EU, which, as we must remind ourselves, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales did not vote for. And I was actually over in Bed a few days last. I'm really struck by the kind of resignation and, lack of get up and go that's paramount among the people in Belfast, and just kind of resignation to the fact that they're not going to have, look like anyway, to have their own parliament installment up and running any soon. It's one's interest what Boris Johnson did last week in pushing that bill on the protocol through Parliament. I've actually been following what the EU's total response is, apart from what you read out earlier, Andrew, or what can be done. But at the time, it must have been seen that this was the best of a bad job. And I think that in the long run, it's more likely to lead to a united Ireland than anything else. And is that maybe Johnson does want to see the breakup of the United Kingdom deep down, because that's certainly what he seems to be doing with his actions at the moment.
Thank you, Maureen. And also in the context of the way in which the UK government conducted itself and conducted both during the negotiations and since, Lord Frost, who negotiated much of the protocol, seems now to be eyeing a job for himself in politics. He's been very active, making sure he's staying in the news agenda over the last few weeks. If Lord Frost is to get in, is to seek political position and is to get involved, or is to involve himself once more with negotiations with the EU, do you think that things will get better or worse?
God help us. Lord Frost was chief executive of the Scotch Whisky Association, and many MSPs came across him in that role. He is no friend of Scotland. So if he was to become any more involved in government in a role through being a member of the House of Lords, which is an anathema to me anyway, it doesn't bode well for Scotland at all in terms of Scotland being treated fairly by the Westminster government. So that would fill me with horror and just make me go out and canvass even more than I do for independence in October 2023.
Thank you, Maureen. We'll move on now. We'll talk a little bit less about politics for our next story, because BP has been accused of dumping industrial waste at sea after starting to drop thousands of tons of oil pipes and other equipment into a legally protected marine wildlife zone in the Atlantic. Confidential documents seen by The Guardian show the oil company sought approval to dump 14 pipes and control cables 120 miles west of Shetland after finishing drilling at the site. It started dropping 4 days ago onto a marine protection area, an MPA, after being given clearance last week by the UK's decommissioning regulator. The area is designated an MPA under international law because of its rare giant deep-sea sponges, its gravel ecosystem, and the ocean quahog, a very slow-growing mollusk. It's a type of clam. They are one of the longest living animals on Earth and have been known to live for 400 to 500 years. BP has been drilling there for 25 years at depths of up to 600 metres, using a floating oil ship called the Petroreal Foinaven, which is to be scrapped. The company also plans to drop all the ship's steel mooring lines and anchors onto this site, totalling more than 4,000 tonnes. BP, which made £5 billion in profits in the first quarter of 2022 on the back of the global surge in oil and gas prices, had originally applied to the regulator for approval to lower the 14 pipes and cables in a controlled manner. But after a series of delays, those plans were repeatedly changed, and it has now been allowed to release all those pipes where they join the ship, so they will fall unguided onto the sea floor. 4 have been released so far. The riser cables are about more than 800 metres long, and the umbilical cables up to 4 kilometres long. They weigh nearly 2,500 tonnes. A source with direct knowledge of the plans, describing the web of cables as being like a pile of cooked spaghetti, said it would be immensely costly and challenging to recover all 14 cables and risers, suggesting it would cost tens of millions of pounds and need special retrieval ships and underwater vessels. BP insists that dumping the cables will have little impact on the seabed and will still allow the pipes to be recovered later. It has given itself 6 years to decide whether to resume drilling at Foinaven, sell it, or to finally decommission it. Doug Parr, who's the chief scientist at Greenpeace UK, said the only circumstances in which any company should contemplate dumping hardware onto the seabed in an uncontrolled manner would be to save lives in an emergency. The fact that BP is proposing to do this simply out of expediency is very hard to defend. So, Maureen, firstly, what do you think a 400-year-old quahog is going to think when BP begins dropping piping and cabling and more than 4,000 tonnes of anchoring and cables on top of them?
Well, we wonder how many are going to survive if that heavyweight stuff is going to just drop right on them. It's horrific, actually, and I find it difficult to comprehend that this is actually happening and that the story in The Guardian today is true. I mean, when you think, I used to work in the oil industry, and protecting the environment is something that has developed over the years. And when you think about all the discussions that have been had about decommissioning rig platforms like the Brent Alpha, Brent Delta, and taking everything on shore is now the norm, because there was a big fight, if you remember, about one of the first platforms that was going to be decommissioned, and eventually it was agreed that it had to be all taken on shore. For BP to then do this now, after all we're talking about in the environment, and not knowing what the long-term effect will be of all this rubbish dumped on the seabed and what will leach or whatever, and given that it's an MPA, MPAs are really, really important. The Scottish Government has a good record on creating MPAs around our own coasts. And for this to happen, I just find it's quite incredible, really, that this is actually happening. And I hope that it's brought up by MPs at Westminster as soon as possible. But whether they have been given permission to do this, surely not. And if they have, that is an absolute sacrilege. And in this day and age, to be even contemplating doing that, But when you think that the whole atmosphere of this government is letting companies get away with anything they want, whether it be the P&O way they sack the workers, this is what rampant free market conservatism does to a country, and it's absolutely awful. I'm really, really heartbroken.
Well, Maureen, you mentioned, well, sorry, first of all, and reflecting again on Stephen Kerr, it just occurred to me that some of the Quahog were likely older than Johnson's Precious Union, which maybe puts it into perspective. But anyway, I appreciate that they sought and, surprise, surprise, obtained permission from the regulator. But do BP and the likes, and as you say, you've worked in the oil sector, but do BP and the likes not recognise the moral and the ethical aspects in conducting the business like this?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's absolutely shocking. And given that they're making massive profits at the moment, more than they're going to be taxed on the windfall tax, there is absolutely no reason for them not to take that stuff on shore and have it recycled. Absolutely nothing. There are plenty of places now up and down our coasts who do this, who recycle stuff, and to dump it on the seabed in this day and age is, as I say, really, really. I mean, what are the fishermen saying? What if the fishermen go out on that area and are allowed, might not be allowed to fish very much if it's an MPA, but being an MPA makes it even worse. But supposing some other vessel gets its nets or its gear or gets stuck with that stuff on the ground, what's going to happen if there's an accident? I mean, I just find it unbelievable that they got permission from a regulator, and something must happen to the regulator. It was allowed. And is there no legislation in place to make this completely and utterly illegal? If not, there should be.
Well, and that's the other point I wanted to talk to you about, Maureen. With regard to the regulation of this, do you think is it right or is it sensible that the environmental impact of operations on Scotland's continental shelf is regulated from London?
Well, no, it's not. But at the moment, as we know, that's one of the issues that's completely reserved, and there have been no moves to have it devolved to Scotland. But, that's clearly something that an independent Scotland would find, I'm sure, I hope, abhorrent and would stop. And, the sooner that happens, the better, because if one company does it and gets away with it, are we going to see other companies do it in other parts of our seas? And as I say, surely organisations like the Scottish Fishermen's Federation and others should be protesting vehemently that this has happened.
Maureen, do you think that this is a reflection of how importantly Westminster and politicians in Westminster, who from time to time receive funding, how important they regard the oil and gas sector, how close they are to the oil and gas sector, and it's one of the underlying reasons why the resistance to voters in Scotland having the right of self-determination is so opposed. Is it simply coming back to cash?
Well, I mean, if we make comparisons with Norway, we see how much financial support from government that the oil companies get for exploitation of the UK continental shelf compared to Norway, and how very little money has come to the Treasury, or of course we've got no oil fund compared to Norway. So it was such an opportunity missed. However, we could be a very rich country now if we'd had independence before now. But all is not lost, because we have a wonderfully vibrant renewables sector. We've been given a second chance, which could make a lot more money for Scotland. And we need to make sure that we have independence sooner rather than later, so that we can grasp these opportunities. But it does show how in cahoots big business and the oil and gas industry is with the UK government. I think those of us who have been on the cross-party group on oil and gas, for example, in the Scottish Parliament, have seen that work time and time again to the detriment of seas around Scotland. And this is just perhaps the latest example of that, which, as I say already, is just horrific.
Thank you, Maureen. We'll move on now to another story because food insecurity will worsen in 20 hunger hotspots this year through a combination of rising conflict and climate change, putting a record 49 million people in 46 countries at risk of famine, key UN food agencies have forecast. Some 750,000 people are already experiencing catastrophic famine, including starvation and acute malnutrition in Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Somalia, South Sudan, and Yemen. This is according to the latest report from the World Food Programme and the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. Climate shocks will continue to drive acute hunger in the outlook period from June to September 2022, and we have entered a new normal where frequent and recurring droughts, flooding, hurricanes, and cyclones decimate farming, drive displacement, and push millions to the brink in countries across the report said. Conflict and organised violence were the main sources of food insecurity in Africa and the Middle East, specifically in northern Nigeria, the Central Sahel, the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Somalia, South Sudan, Yemen, and Syria. The war in Ukraine has exacerbated the food crisis by driving up the price of agricultural commodities. Russia and Ukraine together account for around 30% of the global wheat trade. New countries being added to the hotspot list include Ukraine, Sri Lanka, Zimbabwe, Benin, Guinea, and Cabo Verde. La Nina, a climate pattern that changes ocean surface currents and brings cooler water up from the depths of the Pacific Ocean, has also exacerbated the weather conditions. The phenomenon has been present since late 2020 in a twin seasonal occurrence that has brought severe floods and below average temperatures to Australia and drier than usual conditions to Africa. This has contributed to food shortages in some areas, including Afghanistan and Eastern Africa. Maureen, it's not that long since COP26 in Glasgow, and COP26 in Glasgow discussed, amongst other things, these specific issues. So do you think that this report from the UN to UN agencies is going to cut through with people and with politicians, and that they're going to respond and react to this latest report?
Well, I think if politicians are going to be taken seriously after all the great things that were said and came out of COP, to not take this seriously, and I think, to be fair, organisations like the EU are taking it very seriously. I mean, the war in Ukraine has highlighted to most of us, I think, just how much of a breadbasket for the whole world Ukraine has been, and that cutting off the supply of food is being coupled with climate changes is being catastrophic for so many countries around the world. Now, what we do about it, apart from making sure that we try and cut our emissions and everything, is whether those countries that can produce more food step up to the plate to do that and make sure that it's exported to the countries that need it most. And it seems to me in the UK, as a farmer's daughter, that increasing food production is the last thing that this Tory government want. Now, people think that the Tories are the farmers' friends. Actually, as my father used to say, farmers are under Labour than the Tories, but they always think they should be Tories, a bit of land. But this is really serious, because if those areas that can produce food to the maximum don't, taking into account climate and the use of fertilizers, reducing the use of fertilizers and everything, then we are going to experience more food shortages than we are at the moment. And we've seen that, food is going to waste, which I find criminal, because we can't get people to pick it. There is a real crisis in food that's not being addressed, I think, not just in the UK, but worldwide. And I can't remember hearing that this was really something that was debated at any length at the G7 or the UN meetings that we've had recently. I might be wrong on that, but it's seriously, I haven't heard something come out of there that has given me any sense of anyone being on top of this crisis. And we know it's the poorest in the poorest countries who will be affected, rather than those of us who are in a much more fortunate position.
That's absolutely right, Maureen, and very wise words from your late father there. One other aspect of this that I wanted to touch on with you, the report makes it plain that these challenges, these problems with both weather changes and hunger hotspots and conflict are going to drive migration of people. They're going to drive people seeking refuge from starvation. So given that that's been something that's been the treatment, the reception and treatment of refugees has been on the front pages for some weeks in the UK. What do you think will happen to those who will now start to seek refuge from the worst hit areas and will likely start to seek refuge in the West?
Well, are they going to be sent to Rwanda from if they try to get to Britain? That's not going very well. But I still can't get my head around why wanting to come to this country, wanting to claim refugee status, and can't work, and yet we have a shortage of labour. I just don't see how the two can't be married up. I mean, it's dogma that is driving Tory, but I'm old enough to remember Band-Aid and terrible droughts in Sudan and Somalia. And if there are more countries on that list, what is the West and the rich countries, what are they going to do to help those countries if they don't want this mass migration to more temperate lands? And if it's not something like the UN or the G7 that's going to address this, then who is? And, than there is at the moment. It's for economic reasons, but if mainly young men who are seeking refugee status and coming to Western Europe. But in this situation, then we could see whole families migrating. And, when you hear of people traipsing through Europe from the Middle East, to think of people traipsing from Central Africa to Morocco or Egypt, trying then across to Europe, it's just not possible to contemplate that. So must step up to make sure that where food can be grown in these countries, that every help is given to them. And I mean, we're blessed in Scotland having places like the James Hutton Institute who that can help and help. We've got wonderful water agencies in Scotland that go all over the world to help and are doing that already. So I'm sure as an independent country, we could offer a lot more each our agenda if it's under a Westminster government.
Completely. Thank you, Maureen. Now, for our final story, we'll come back to Scotland, because ambitious new targets have been set out for NHS Scotland to address the impact of the pandemic on long waiting times for planned care. The Health Secretary Hamza Yousaf announced NHS Scotland will aim to eradicate waits of more than 2 years and then 1 year in most specialities by September 2024. Mr Yousaf has now asked health boards to take a focused approach to tackle the waiting lists now that activity in the NHS is beginning to recover following the pandemic. The targets are to treat those patients waiting longer than 2 years for outpatients in most specialities by the end of August this year, 18 months for outpatients in most other specialities by the end of December this year, 1 year for outpatients in most specialities by the end of March 2023, 2 years for inpatient and day cases in most specialities by the end of September this year, 18 months for inpatient and day cases most other specialities by the end of September 2023, and 1 year for inpatient and day cases in most specialities by the end of September 2024. Mr Yousaf said, "We know that waiting times have grown as a result of the pandemic, which is why we now need to focus on treating these people that are waiting too long for treatment. From speaking to patients and clinicians across the country, I know there is a physical and mental consequence in having to wait a long period to be treated. That is why addressing long waits is a key focus of our plans for NHS recovery." Now, Maureen, you served as the Public Health Minister and then as a Minister for Mental Health. And so what strikes you about the current Health Secretary refocusing on cutting waiting lists following the pandemic?
Having truly important times are to government. We always were waiting for the latest figures to come out to see if improvements were being made. And to be fair to the Scottish Government, pre-COVID, we were doing better than any other part of the UK in getting waiting lists down. And then, of course, we have the perfect storm of COVID on top of an ageing population and more people affected by it. One of the good things that the government COVID was embarking on was setting up national treatment centres, which are designed to separate out hips, knees and eye operations, these routine operations, from the general throughput in theatres. So they're separate from operations that are required for car accidents or something like that. So very often routine operations were cancelled because something urgent came in and the people's operations were cancelled. So these national treatment centres mean that these operations can go ahead regardless of what's coming in to the theatres. And also, in my time in government, we were beginning to make sure that theatres were used more efficiently, so that, for example, the surgical teams were moving from theatre to theatre, and then these theatres were being cleaned so that the teams were moving around rather than waiting for theatres to be cleaned after operation. All these things happening throughout the NHS. There's good practice in some areas that must be rolled out in other areas. But I think it's important to have these targets, and our NHS are under such pressure. I feel so sorry for our healthcare workers. They're just working their socks off all day, every day. I think if this gives them clarity of who's got to be done first and in what order, this will help. But it's of cold comfort, I think, to those who are in real pain, waiting for operations, which can not only affect physical health, but as you said, mental health. So in that situation, GP surgeries with counsellors and physiotherapists need to be at the top of their game in helping people while they're waiting for their operations.
Thank you, Maureen. That's a very, very helpful view on what's been happening and the progress that's being made. But that is all that we have time for this evening. We've let the programme run on a little bit in case there was further news from Westminster, but in the circumstances that has not been forthcoming. So, in making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to continue to develop the station and make new programmes for you. If you would like to support us, then please subscribe or donate to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you'd like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, we will be here again tomorrow evening with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in and join us again then. And that's the way it is at that's the way it is at Scotland at 8. Thank you to everyone who's been watching this evening, and very special thanks to our very special guest, Maureen Watt. Thanks, Maureen.
You're welcome.
Please have a very peaceful evening, and I hope that you can join us again here on Broadcasting Scotland very soon. Bye-bye.